So, hello everybody. I would like to welcome you to this final session of this very interesting 3-day conference. Today we're talking about the age of bots and robotisation of truth. And we're here to discuss the spread of disinformation and propaganda on the internet. And it's a bit of a controversial topic because the internet was once considered well, basically a revolution of free speech, and it was thought to produce much better informed citizens. However, nowadays we are witnessing widespread attempts to abuse the internet to sway public opinion and even to influence democratic institutions and processes. So we are now welcoming the speakers on stage. It's a very interesting round of experts who will discuss the topic with us. Please give them a round of applause. So I would like to welcome Mr. Yanis Sarts. He's director of the Strategic Communication Center of Excellence at NATO in Riga. I would also like to welcome Mr. Scott Carpenter, who is the Managing Director of Jigsaw in Washington. I would also like to welcome Ms. Laura Rosenberger, who is the Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy in Washington. And finally, Mr. Daniel Milo, who is the Head of Strategic Communication program here at GLOBSEC. Now, before we start the discussion, I would like to remind everyone first that you here in the audience prepare already during the discussion some of the questions, because I would like to give you also the opportunity to ask questions. And please don't forget that you can also submit them via the Slido system, which I will be checking here, and this is also actually for people interesting who are watching via the live link. So, let's start, kick off the debate. The debate has a lot to do with the internet, and there are some technical questions here also on the internet. How basically so-called automated bots, or robots, that's actually short for robot, influence the way we see information on the internet and trying to actually influence our opinion. And I would first maybe like to start off with you, Laura, maybe to give us a bit of an idea how this fits in the general debate and what role they actually play in the broader debate.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks to GLOBSEC for hosting this important conversation. I'm really lucky to be joined on this panel with a lot of deep expertise, so I'm looking forward to a good conversation. I think the question you started off with here, how do bots fit into this broader picture, is a really important one. I think sometimes when we're talking about the role of information on the internet, on social media, there's a lot of focus on bots in particular, but it's important to step back and understand that bots and automated accounts are really just one piece of this broader information ecosystem. The internet has really revolutionized how people receive information, but it has presented opportunities as people try to order information and sort through information on the internet to manipulate that information ecosystem, to distort the information space in one direction or another in order to promote the idea that certain topics are more prevalent, to increase activity around particular topics of conversation, and in order to really manipulate the users who are seeing information in a particular lens. I think it's also important, though, to remember and some of my fellow panelists, I think, will speak to this, not all bots are bad. We talk a lot about bots, I think, sometimes in this negative context. And bots in and of themselves are not inherently bad. There are all kinds of automated services and accounts that provide really important functions for providing information on the internet. One of the examples I often use is in the US, we have something called Amber Alerts. These are alerts that are sent out when a child has gone missing, and it's incredibly important to get information out very, very quickly to a particular community in order to alert people to be on the lookout for a missing child. And the system that does this is highly automated, and on the internet it uses a system of bots to actually push this information out very, very robustly. It's a very important public safety system. And so I think as we think about the character of bots, I think we'll probably be talking mostly about the malicious kind here, but I think it's important to bear in mind that it's not bots in and of themselves that are the problem. The question is just the lack of transparency in many ways and the way in which these tools are used to manipulate the information ecosystem.
No, thanks. That's really, really important. I was wondering, Milo, if you could maybe help us gain an even better understanding, because as a normal citizen, as someone who is also a lot on Facebook, on Twitter, I'm wondering is there a way that we can differentiate what is a good and what is a bad bot? And actually, maybe you could give some more examples of bots that are useful, that are helping, for example, in customer service, or so that we get a better idea of just a normal user on the internet, how we can find out what is manipulating and what is a good bot.
Thank you, Stephanie. I just want to support the notion of Laura that we really need to distinguish between different types of bots on the internet. And just to give you an idea, according to available research, 55% of all online traffic is carried out by crawlers and bots. And of course, not all these bots are, malicious actors trying to manipulate our opinions, but they perform a number of very useful purposes. And basically, bot is any type of automated system that makes certain tasks easier, that increase and improve customer experience, and basically help us to navigate the internet much, much better. The problem comes when bots are being used for nefarious purposes, for illegitimate purposes, and this is, I think, the topic of our discussion today. But again, just to give you a bit of an overview of the situation now, according to new study from Pew Research, bots account for more activity on Twitter than the humans already right now. If you look at some specific examples, in the case of US presidential elections, 20% of all traffic during that peak was actually a bot traffic that was created by bots. And in terms of comparison, Trump bots, there are five Trump bots for one bot supporting Hillary campaign. And just the last figure, 1% of accounts on Twitter during the Brexit accounted for 1/3 of all the traffic. So these are these spikes, and the type of bots that we should be speaking about are political bots. Bots designed specifically to change people's opinion, to demobilize or even demonize opposition, political opposition. We speak of Twitter bombs that are used to basically disable any civilized discussion using hashtags and disable certain hashtags as such. And these techniques are not used only by Russia or China, but actually the available research shows that more than 30 countries are using political bots for various purposes. Not all of them are negative ones, but the phenomenon is much widespread than we might think.
I mean, now that you're giving us all this information, that this is also being used in democracies, I think the question that I would like to pin you down on even further is, I mean, how, if I'm not someone who has all this technical knowledge, if I'm just a normal user on Facebook, how do I detect that something is a bot? How do I know that I'm actually interacting with a bot?
Well, there are different types of bots. There are some of the crude bots that really just replicate automatically certain messages. That is easy to detect, especially on Twitter. If you see that you suddenly are being followed by 10 new accounts that have no other connections, that tweet very often and repeated messaging with a very focused thematic issues, that is a clear sign of bot activity. On the other hand, what we see now, and I'm sure that Yanis will speak about this even more, is increased sophistication of bots. And basically, it's an arms race between the platforms that try to limit the bot activity on their platforms for obvious reasons, and the bot developers that try to hide and mimic human behavior. So I believe it's becoming more and more difficult to actually distinguish between bot activity and genuine accounts if we speak of these more sophisticated bots.
Okay. Well, maybe I can just move on then directly to you, Yanis, so to give us even more background on this. And I think you have also studied the use of these bots in very specific circumstances, like in hybrid warfare, which I think we have lots of specific examples that you could maybe talk about.
Yes, well, thank you. And let me first start about why bots matter and how they change the social discourse. Let me start with a story from yesterday. After the great gala dinner, a group came back to this beautiful hotel and sat down in the lobby. And some of the people I see here, there was like 5 of us. But at that moment, that was the biggest group in the lobby. And then people kept pouring in back from the dinner. And some of them thought, well, that's good to stay for a drink. And what happened, we were the biggest group. So most of the people started to tilt towards our group. We ended up like 15 or something. That is a human behavior. We tilt towards bigger groups. So if you happen to own a robotic network that is not kind of good bots that you recognize that's a bot, but somebody that is trying to replicate like it is a human, and there's a large group of humans, then you kind of tilt. That's human nature. The other thing is an issue of trust. I think all across the societies, the level of trust in central authority is going down. Where it is still strong is what your neighbor thinks, what your relative, what your friend thinks. That's where the trust levels still hold on. So if you can, through the bot systems, mimic, I'm kind of somebody who's known by your neighbor or your friend, the trust level is up. So that is why it is an effective way to infiltrate the social processes, the cognitive space of a given country. And I typically ask, I assume most of you are in social networks, have you met a human disguised bot? Can I have a show of hands? How many have met? Well, so you should think twice. What we do, we track botnets that talk about NATO in the Baltic and Poland. And we track it into the 2 language spaces, English and Russian. And in the Russian language, the first we measured, that was about a year ago, we recognized the amount of content that is generated by bot accounts in that sort of sample size is 85%. Only 15% humans. In English, it was 40. So in some niche areas, it's really huge, and it's actually distorting. Also, one has to remember, democracy, if we think about democracy, it's about listening into people. And now many are running these tools that kind of listen into the noise, what people are talking. So if you're in a senator's office and senator kind of tries to keep track of what the constituencies are talking, then if you happen to have a botnet in that environment, you can alter the reality and make senator think that constituency is way in a very different opinion.
How does that work in practice? Sorry to interrupt.
Well, there are systems that kind of track what the people are talking about on this given subject. And for instance, if somebody has deployed the botnet in that area and uses it, as I've said, up to 85% of the traffic might be bot generated, but you take it for granted that's a real people. So your analyses are wrong, your further actions are wrong. So that is a way you can manipulate. On the standards, yes, there are very different levels of botnets. They are very simplistic botnets run by, I would say, amateurs. Then there are more professional botnets run, as we see it from our research, for for business. You can hire them, and they do, whatever you want. And states hire them, companies hire them, and then there are state-owned botnets. And the ones that are state-owned, they typically are pretty well developed. They basically, we believe, are IE system driven, so they are developing. And for instance, our system that tracks these robots are also IE systems. So there's always like, who has a edge all the time. So that's the arms race, I suspect.
Yeah, that's interesting,
Zuckerberg
because
talked
that's something
about.
I think we should speak about afterwards, is what actually to do against it. But before we come to that, I wanted to give a chance also to Scott, maybe to pick up on some of the things that have been mentioned, and maybe to give us an idea how these bots are also used in democracies. I mean,
Sure.
we've spoken now about
Yes.
some of the other examples, but I think that would be really interesting to hear.
Well, I don't know how interesting it will be, but I will try to make it so. But first, let me just thank again the GLOBSEC and the organizers of this forum for having me here today. I really enjoy it. For those of you who are in the panel immediately preceding this one in this room, Steve Clemens and all those people took their ties off because they were pretending like they were from Silicon Valley. And I am from Silicon Valley, and I'm wearing a tie, and it's one of the very, very few opportunities I get to do it. So I'm enjoying it at the moment, even though it's cutting off oxygen to my brain. So I am not a bot, but you know that because you're looking at me, you see me. And so what we've talked about already a little bit so far is we've said that there are good bots and there are bad bots. Those good bots are very, very good, and those bad bots can be very, very bad. And the question is, especially for the types of bots that we're talking about, those that are politically oriented, and it doesn't mean just in terms of candidates or election environments, but on divisive political issues where they can also have influence, where they are coordinated not just on Twitter, but across platforms, where they have a deeper impact in that area, and where they are, what is the word I'm looking for? Where they are misrepresentative. That's the other key characteristic of these sorts of bots that we're talking about. So then the challenge comes, how do you detect bots of this nature when they become increasingly sophisticated in terms of how they're targeting, who they're targeting? Because what we're going to move into very quickly here is that, as Laura started us out, is that these bots are a very small part of this problem. They help to amplify. But they are not great at generating the key insights, the key misinformation or disinformation that humans can do. So what has become much more problematic is when actual humans are masquerading as other human beings online, and then bots are amplifying what they themselves are tweeting or they themselves are interacting with on Facebook. That the information or disinformation in this case, the disinformation food chain is being amplified by these bots, but they're not the seminal part of the problem. And I think that that's the area that I'm hoping that we can get into a bit. What our team is doing is trying to, this cross-platform piece is so important. If you are an investigative journalist and you are looking to investigate money laundering from a certain country, if you're an investigative reporter in that country, you're only going to get so far, right? You're going to have to understand what's happening in London. You're going to have to understand what's happening in New York. You're going to have to tie it all together to be able to get a complete picture. And one of the challenges we have in the tech industry is we don't talk cross-platform about what we're seeing and what we're doing, so that we're not able to get that complete picture. And I think that that's one of the big challenges that we have going forward. But what our team is trying to do is, are there ways to detect through signals what are coordinated bots, and coordinated in the sense that human bots, in the sense that you have these networks of people who are pretending to be others, both in the United States, they're trolls, but they could be in the United States, they could be in Germany, they could be in Russia, they could be in France, but they're all tweeting at the exact same time, despite those time zones. And they're using they're using language that is so similar that it's hard to believe that they are not being centrally coordinated somehow. That's really important for us to understand, but there is a question about what to do about it that we can come to. But ultimately, we need to be able to understand what's happening across our platforms, and the only way
So
to
Scott,
do that is
sorry to interrupt you here,
Yeah.
because I think that's really important. And the point that I would really be very interested in is, I mean, you're saying there are certain people, they create what we know as fake accounts, and then you have an automated bot that amplifies the message of that fake account, right?
Mhm.
So could it be, for example, that during our debate here, which is also streamed live, where people can go on Twitter, on Facebook to comment, I mean, could there be someone launching a bot right now?
Well, typically, I think what Milo was saying earlier is my very first experience with this was at a conference in 2008. So Twitter was really still in its infancy, and I was at a conference with a Bahraini activists, and they were going to be presenting at this big human rights conference. And they had two big screens that were showing the tweets from the people in the audience as they were tweeting about the event. As soon as the Bahraini activists took the floor and started to speak, there was just this avalanche of porn on Twitter. And it lasted until they stopped speaking.
Yeah.
So essentially, the conversation through these bot networks was completely censored from the perspective of anyone trying to follow the feed on what those people were talking about. So if people don't like what I'm talking about right now, perhaps the millions of people who are tuning in on Twitter are silencing me by using the hashtag GLOBSEC 2018 to censor me, to keep me from talking.
And if you put it in the crisis scenario where like one account is absolutely important to communicate to people, that is what you can do as well. You can swarm the bots so that you can't hear. And that is a kind of brings it at a very different level where it is actually sometimes a matter of a national security.
Yanis,
Laura,
if
I think
just-
you wanted to say something. Sorry, Milo.
Yanis, just to comment on this, there was a very good example of such attempt on this fake attack on a chemical plant in the US that was very well prepared, very well coordinated, included setting up fake websites, Twitter accounts, use of bots. So it was a very well designed operation, I think, proving the concept that yes, it is doable to trick people into believing that something happened that actually never happened in real life, but yet it created the impact on people's minds and their behavior actually.
And that was 4 years ago.
Yeah, so nowadays I guess it will be even more clever and more elaborate, yeah.
Laura, I think you had a point on this also.
Well, I'm in violent agreement with everybody on this stage, but I just want to follow up on a couple of really important points that Scott made. One is, the other varieties of players in this, right? So the role that the automated accounts, the bots, play with the human-operated troll or sock puppet accounts, which is when when it's a sort of fake persona operating an account that is pretending to be someone else, and then you have things called cyborgs that are basically these crossbreeds of human and automated. And it's that whole ecosystem that I was speaking to in the beginning that really is what's able to manipulate this information system in this way. The role then, certain platforms are more vulnerable to automation and bot activity than others. So as Scott was mentioning, what you see in this cross-platform coordination is particularly when you're talking about state actors, that you can really have this coordination behind the scenes to then be able to use different tools on different platforms to push out a coordinated message that plays a different role in different parts of the ecosystem. Another example I just want to point to is Yannis was talking about some of the examples on how to manipulate public opinion. One example that we saw in the US pretty recently, and again, driving home this point, it's not just elections, it's about a lot of different ways to influence our democratic conversation and debate, is in the discussion about net neutrality in the US. There was a comment period put forward by the Federal Communications Commission about whether or not net neutrality was something that should be changed and altered. And there was a flood of activity for comments. Well, it turns out after the fact, a bunch of these comments were actually from fake accounts that it's still under investigation, but appear to have been people who had their identities stolen in a variety of hacks, probably conducted by a state actor. And then that these fake personas were then used to put up comments that over and over and over again, very similar content, as Scott was saying, that you would see from Joe in Indiana and Jane in Pennsylvania and all this stuff to manipulate the debate around the question of net neutrality. So lots of different ways that this can manifest. The last point I just want to make on this.
Were they for or against?
They were for eliminating net neutrality. Yeah. And the last point on this is I think Daniel gave some interesting examples about the U.S. Presidential election conversation. I'm actually most concerned about a couple of things in that context. One is the automated discussion that distorted, again, sort of what are the hot topics, what should people flock to, was definitely part of this. But the use of the fake accounts, the Internet Research Agency accounts that we now know were created on almost every social media platform out there, that actually brought in people to join groups, that had the mainstream media picking up quotes from accounts that were not actually real Americans, but were pretending to be, and that actually helped to sort of organize rallies in the U.S. People actually showed up at rallies that were organized by pages from fake accounts created in St. Petersburg, but unknown to these Americans. To come back to the bot question for 1 second on this, just last week, the House Intelligence Committee released the full data set of the ads that were purchased by the Internet Research Agency on Facebook. And one of the more intriguing ads in there was one that promoted this application called Face Music. It doesn't fit any category that we would talk about in terms of quote, disinformation or quote unquote fake news to promote a particular view. It was encouraging people to download this application. Well, what experts found when they went into the back end of this application is when users downloaded this app onto their computer, it then installed a plugin into their browser that the user didn't know about. That plugin turned their computer into part of a botnet that was creating automated traffic to websites that were being promoted by the Kremlin and the Internet Research Agency in order to drive up traffic to particular news stories, thereby gaming algorithms on social media platforms and search platforms like Google and YouTube. So it's this very complicated ecosystem that has many, many different dimensions when it's being used by a nefarious actor.
Okay, I think if before opening the floor for questions, Yannis, I wanted maybe to ask you again, because this was now referred to several times about activities from Russia, and I think many of us have probably read about what Laura has also referred to, like troll farms in Russia and attempts to influence not only elections, but maybe even attempts to influence hybrid warfare.
Well, from my perspective, there is very few more important national security issues than protect your own elections. So I'd see that as part and parcel of the same thing. Russian operation is comprehensive. So it goes from having a typical networks of influence from the good old Cold War playbook. It goes to the online activity where we talk about the botnets, paid human trolls, cyber accounts across different platforms, increasingly going also, we should not forget about the encrypted systems like WhatsApp. then they're using big data, whether by buying the services or otherwise, to be able to better micro-target. And all of that is meant to spoil the process. I'm not sure they can create a new dynamic, but what they're trying to achieve is to use existing vulnerabilities, divisions, to deepen them, to make the same issue, which is for democracy, what's the key thing is dialogue between the groups. You kill the dialogue, democracy is in peril, and that is what they're trying to do, and sometimes too successfully. I would not say, which I don't want to leave everybody with the impression we're kind of can't do anything about it. But first thing we have to do is recognize there's an issue, and there are quite a lot of things we can do, we can talk about later. But we have to start doing these.
So maybe we should start talking about what can we actually do against this. Would this be something for you, Milo? Is there a way for civil society to do something against it, or could one maybe even, launch counter automated bots? I mean, if you can launch a bad bot, maybe you can launch a good one against it. Would that be a strategy, or is that opening up even more dangerous possibilities?
Yeah, I think we outlined the situation pretty well, and there are many different shades and aspects of this whole issue. But I think the first principle in pushing back against the negative consequences of the political bots specifically would be to ensure transparency. Because, we spoke about good bots and bad bots, and the main distinguishing character between the two is the transparency. If we or the social media platforms would be able to detect and to label clearly this is a bot activity, it will diminish to a great deal the negative impact of the bots. Of course, that would also be the whole purpose of why these state actors specifically create such networks, but I think this is a first and very necessary step to create. And then to follow up on your question, I alluded to the very same idea already last year at a different conference when I said, well, perhaps we need a pro-democracy bots, because just imagine a situation, all the people sitting in this room, you are tweeting or you will be tweeting about what's going on at this very stage. And then suddenly a botnet comes in and all your voices, all your tweets will be drowned in a noise, such as was described previously in this very, very interesting example. But unless we have at our disposal the same type of capabilities, the same type of technology that would enable us to spread our message beyond the individuals sitting in this room, we run into risk of being, outgunned and outnumbered by automated systems. So I do believe that we as civil society organizations, as institutions such as NATO, we would really need to develop these capabilities, but keeping the transparency there. So yes, I think we really need to start thinking about how to distribute our messages more effectively, even using automated systems. However, with a clear disclaimer, this is an automated account, or this is, labeled as such. But I'll be happy to hear other perspectives from the other panelists.
Maybe from you, Scott. I mean, do you have any other ideas what to do against it?
As always, technology is neutral. How you use it, it can be problematic, right? I do not see this type of automated, aggressive silencing of people using bots as a feature of Twitter. I see it as a bug, right? So can you use technology to defeat the technology? Are there ways that signal, again, that I was talking about, if we could figure out what this is organized, inorganic communication that is being used for a very specific political purpose at a very specific time, is there a way to then take some action? If you see that that's happening with using the exact same, the exact same language at the exact same time within milliseconds of one another, maybe that's an indication that you should stop that traffic. You could do that. We saw this happening in a slightly different context, but it's illustrative when and all around the world, there would be a political event that would happen. If you had any type of protest being launched anywhere at all, but I'll use the Kiev protests of a couple years ago, as soon as those protests began, there were all of the all the publishing online in the Ukraine was DDoSed. Right? And so at the very moment everybody's looking to get information about what's happening there, none of those platforms are available to the people who are looking to find them. And so one of the thoughts our team had was, well, DDoS is a solvable problem for individual sites, and we could offer protection for those publishers.
You developed this
Yes,
type
it's called Project Shield. And Shield now protects about 1,000 independent publishers around the world. And to the point about protecting now elections, we want to extend that to campaigns and political organizations who are also trying to get their information out because they are coming under the same sort of problem. Can we find technologies that can help us defeat some of these tactics? Or if we can't defeat them, at least make users aware of them. So if you knew that 85% of the conversation that you were participating in online was by bots, would that change your thinking about what you were consuming a little bit? Maybe. But in any case, rather than, again, looking to censor or compete, I do have some anxiety about having good bots and bad bots battle one another incessantly and trying to compete with one another. I'd rather figure out how to surface really good quality information to people that they can use and have access to in a way that serves the purpose that they're trying to achieve.
I think that's maybe one final question I want to put to the panel before opening the floor. Since I'm working myself as a journalist, I was wondering if you think that conventional journalism, newspapers, can actually help in the debate. I mean, what is their role in fighting this phenomenon of propaganda and bots on the internet? Maybe to both of you, Yanis and Laura.
Well, obviously, traditional journalism is very, very, very important. And one of the problems why we are where we are is that the impact from so-called false power, which is journalism, is being diminished. So yes, it is important, but I would be careful to think how far-reaching the traditional media anymore are, because people exist in echo chambers, and that is increasingly hard to penetrate these. So yes, it is important. It is important to continue, but it cannot anymore be the only solution. I would say platforms have responsibilities. I'm a customer on a number of platforms. I think this is my right to know when I'm addressed by a human or by a bot. And by the way, bots don't have the right of free speech. But even I, with my knowledge of the problem, sometimes I can't distinguish. It used to be some time ago I knew if a really pretty girl tries to follow me, that can't be true. But even now, it's going beyond that. So when I see what some of the our system that brings up these bot accounts by the, looking from a big data perspective on these things, I would not ever tell. So that is a platform's responsibility. Why we talk all about Twitter? Because we can access and review. We don't know about Facebook. Well, we know they're investing quite a lot, but we can't tell. Same for, but still, robotisation in Google and YouTube, also an issue. So also transparency, I think, is something that easy fixes, I think. And then there are more complex things down the road.
Well, maybe what I will do now is move to one of the questions that have been submitted here on Slido, and maybe pose that to you, Laura. Maybe you have some experience with this. I mean, we've now been talking a lot about Twitter, and do you think that there is bot activity, a difference in the bot activity on Twitter and on Facebook? I mean, is from your experience also working in election campaigns, do you see there a difference between the two?
So let me address that, and I do actually want to take on your journalism question too, because
Yes,
I think
that
it's
would
really
be great.
important.
Yep.
So the Twitter and Facebook play different roles in our information ecosystem, just as a starting point. So the sort of first principle question here is they're different platforms with different roles in spreading information as well as disinformation. So yes, there is a difference, number one. Number two, Twitter by its design is actually much more vulnerable to the kind of automated activity we're talking about. I mean, it's a different manifestation on Facebook when it comes to this kind of activity, and the sort of mass scale automation that we're talking about in terms of the bot activity is less prevalent on Facebook. You have on Facebook the problem that you have on Twitter as well, of the creation of the fake accounts, fake personas, fake pages. Facebook's largely about community building. So one of the things we found actually from the analysis of the ads that I mentioned earlier was that actually the earliest phase of the ad purchases in advance of the US election campaign by the Internet Research Agency were largely positive ads. They were focused on building community, bringing people into issues that they cared about, largely on issues that were particularly emotional and in some ways divisive in the US. But when we think about the divisive content, most of what we've seen lately is the much more negative kind of content. In the early days, they were trying to establish these fake personas, accounts, pages as credible messengers, as communities people wanted to join. That's what we saw on Facebook. On Twitter, you see a lot of the driving very particular messages and stories, but when it comes to the real automated accounts, what you actually see is a lot of just sharing of links alone or headlines alone that is actually aimed not at really influencing anybody else on Twitter, but at gaming the broader AI infrastructure, the algorithms that are powering search on Twitter, on Google, on YouTube, et cetera. So yes, there are differences, but it's, again, important to kind of go back to those differences being part of the ecosystem as well. On the journalism question, very briefly, when it comes to the questions of disinformation, there is no question in my mind that journalism plays a really, really important role. I agree with Giannis that the platforms have to play a role, but I would say that context and providing educated, empowering consumers of information is one of the most important ways we can actually fight disinformation and make ourselves less vulnerable to it. Unfortunately, what we saw in the US election campaign, and this is not unique to the US, we've seen it elsewhere, I mentioned earlier that some of the mainstream outlets had picked up some of these fake personas pretending to be Americans and quoted them as real Americans. It's not just some. A Columbia Journalism Review study found that all but one mainstream media outlet had actually carried quotes from fake accounts that were purporting to be Americans, that were actually Russians sitting in St. Petersburg. So journalists need to play a role in carefully vetting the information that they're including, understanding the context, where it's coming from. The other piece is, we haven't touched on it here because it's a little bit of a separate issue, but goes to Giannis's point on how this is a broader strategy that the Kremlin uses. One of the things that we saw in the US as well as in the elections in France is the hack and release tactics of taking information stolen from a campaign or government or whatever, and then weaponizing it and releasing it publicly. The New York Times ran numerous front page stories with weaponized information that had been stolen and released in order to influence the election. And it wasn't just the New York Times, it was most media outlets.
Right, okay. I think since we've only got 15 minutes left, I would want to open the floor and immediately give the microphone to the gentleman in the first row who has already indicated his interest. Please.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you for some very interesting points in this discussion. I'd like to pick up where Scott left off a few moments ago, but I think it has relevance to everything people are saying. There's a real danger in this discussion of losing perspective. Obviously, when there's a threat, we have to meet that threat, but the very title or the starting point of the discussion, disinformation, it's one of the few transplants, like the word intelligentsia from Russian to English, desinformatia. That wasn't a word that was invented in the digital era. That's from the analog era. The Protocols of Zion, arguably the most dangerous document of the 20th century, was not distributed on Twitter or Facebook or Google. The fact is that in a democracy, you ultimately have to trust the people, and you always have had to do that. Twitter, Facebook, and Google are enormously diverse systems. People are not helpless or stupid. Daniel raised a point about echo chambers, and I'm not suggesting he's talking nonsense, but there's an awful lot of nonsense talked about this. I mean, you can be in an echo chamber, and it doesn't mean that you suddenly are stuck in that echo chamber or you arrived at it and were stuck there for the whole of your life. If I see something on Twitter that tells me the capital of France is Jakarta and the capital of Indonesia is Paris, I know that's not true. And, you know, if you're going to divorce this whole question from the wider perspective, it can lead you into a very dangerous route, which is not something that I've just imagined. There is genuine talk about breaking up the tech companies, about censorship of the internet. And I'd put to the panelists that while there are threats there, if we lose perspective, we can end up doing some very dangerous things. I mean, this point about swarming the box, and my final point, sure, it can silence people from the public domain. It's far, far harder to silence people today from the public domain than it has ever been before. People actually have access to the public domain, and I think we need to keep in perspective that actually the digital revolution has been tremendously good in terms of inclusivity in our democracy. And yes, we have problems, but do not lose perspective about them.
So sorry to interrupt you here, but did you have like a specific question?
That is the question. I put that to
the entire
panel.
podium. Who wants to take it? Scott, maybe.
Yeah, well, I obviously agree. I mean, there's no question that the internet has given access to people and different sources of information that they would never have had the ability to achieve without the internet. The internet and its ability to educate, inform, provide a cornucopia of choice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Echo chambers have always existed. All of us in this room are part of some sort of echo chamber. We are in our silo of some sort, and we have to challenge ourselves to reach out to explore other perspectives. And to do that, it's an amazing place, the internet. If you want to challenge yourself, you can be challenged. There's a great subreddit called Change My View, which is a fascinating place on the internet where somebody posits something that they strongly believe and asks people to change their view on that subject. And the debate there is rich, fulsome, highly curated, so that the conversation is not taken over by bots. But that's a part of the internet that I would love to see expanded. To the point, I do want to say, though, one of the things that I was going to answer your question. Journalism is absolutely critical. We know that the business model is in some trouble. One of the things that we were doing was helping to surface facts, fact-checking that was done by journalists. So there are like 600 and something fact-checkers around the world. But they were all doing their own separate thing, and they didn't have a common data schema that they were using to put their fact checks into. And so they were not machine readable. So if you were going to go find that fact, here's what you had to do. First of all, you had to care about facts. Second, you had to be curious, was the thing I'm reading true or not? Then you had to Google it and hopefully find some website somewhere that might give you an indication that this was true or false. Go to that website, read it, consume it yourself, and make a decision. That's a lot to have to do. So right now, because all these fact-checking organizations have adopted this schema, when you put it into Google News or Google Search, and it's a disputed concept, all of the fact checks come up, and you can scroll through them. You can help make up your own mind. But it's the first point that matters. Do you care about facts? Do you care about it?
I would like to maybe give the chance to Milo, because I have someone has submitted a really interesting question here. Sorry, Daniel. via the Slido system. Imagine you have money on developing a good bot. What would it do? How would you do it?
Well, to spread the messages that we've been trying to spread also at this conference, basically just to expand the number of people that could be reached by the conversations that we are having here, that number of people in this room are producing in their reports to much wider audiences, because there is only so many people that we can reach with all our activities. And I see, a huge potential for automated systems as a force multiplier, for better or worse. It's just a tool. And as someone said, the bots could be compared to a gun. You can use the gun for many different purposes. And yes, you can kill a person. Yeah, you can, protect yourself from being killed. So, it only depends on how you use a particular tool. For me, bots are just a tool, and yeah, there are many different, nuances, and we definitely do not want to drown the genuine conversations on social media in kind of a bot war between the two camps. But at the same time, when, let's say, our adversaries are making use of these tools, I think it will be really foolish not to have at least the capability to be able to implement them if there is a need to do so.
Okay. We certainly want to avoid bot wars. I mean, we already have enough conventional wars. So I think the gentleman here in the first row, did you have a question as well? Did you have a question? Yeah, you indicated? That was your question. Okay. Anyone else in the audience? Yes, please.
We had a discussion yesterday with Scott about the topic of finding the early signals of disinformation. And we also talked about an example of LinkedIn, where they almost didn't have any issues with fake news for certain reasons. And since the disinformation problem is more digital, and it's going to be even more digital in the future, I'd like to ask the panelists, what do you think are some technological solutions to fix that?
Fix which piece?
Fix spreading disinformation, identifying it early, and making sure it doesn't spread and change people's minds.
Yeah, I think that the real sensitive issue here is, as we've been discussing on this panel, there are a couple red herrings a little bit. Bots are only one part of this issue, right? The other challenge is that disinformation and misinformation border on things called lies, and lying on the internet is not necessarily illegal, right? And deciding what is true and what is not true is very problematic, right? And so I think there's a deeper challenge here. Part of the reason I was pointing to the signals that I was pointing to is not to make any evaluation as to whether or not this is true or false, misinformation or disinformation. When you look at some of the major platforms that are accused of spreading misinformation, disinformation, including like RT, they report a lot of straight news. They just have a perspective on that news, but the facts are no different than what the Washington Post might be reporting about them. It's just the spin that they're putting on them. But the facts can be agreed. Not all the time.
Sometimes.
Yes, some facts. So I'm using it as an example that in some instances it's the perspective that's being layered on top of specific facts that is problematic. What I'm concerned about is the coordinated, inorganic, politically motivated, state-sponsored dissemination of whatever that information is, and providing signal so that we can understand it. And I think that that's something that's very difficult to do, and because the platforms are not talking with one another, it's hard to trace, and it's hard to fundamentally stop because of the different. They are coordinated. They are able to be on all platforms all at the same time, and none of us have insight into that. So being able to share information, one of the reasons why I want Facebook to create something like Jigsaw there, is that so we can have some of these conversations, for instance.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I know we could go on forever, but I was just being told that we have to really close on time because we have actually the closing remarks of the president of GLOBSEC coming up in, I think, 1 minute from now, so, or 2 minutes. So I'm really sorry. I will have to just close the session here. I would like to thank everyone for participating. Remind the audience that you have feedback questionnaires on your chairs somewhere that you should be filling in and giving us feedback. And well, finally, thanking everyone for your interest, for taking part. And that's it. Thanks. So at 1:30 to remind you that Robert Vass is speaking at the Danube Space.